Have you ever had to play peacekeeper in your household?
Picture this. It's 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, and I'm staring at my phone, heart pounding, as my own mother delivers the gut punch over a crackly line from back home in Ohio. Sarah, don't come. Your divorce is just too darn embarrassing, and we can't handle the pitying looks from the neighbors. I froze, the kind of freeze that turns your world upside down, but instead of screaming back, I hung up quietly, letting the silence be my first weapon. What happened next? A revenge so sweet it filled a mansion with joy, but laced with secrets that still keep me up at night. Stick around, because this tale of family betrayal and unexpected comeback will have you questioning loyalties you thought were unbreakable. I remember that crisp October evening like it was etched into my brain with a hot iron, sitting alone in my cramped apartment in Chicago, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing over takeout orders. When my phone buzzed with my mother's name on the screen, and I picked up expecting the usual chatter about pie recipes or Aunt Linda's latest health scare, but instead her voice came through sharp and clipped, laced with that Midwestern politeness she wielded like a shield, telling me straight out that I shouldn't bother showing up for Thanksgiving this year because my divorce from Mark had turned me into some kind of family skeleton they couldn't afford to rattle in front of the relatives. Especially not with everyone whispering about how he'd run off with his assistant 6 months earlier, leaving me to pick up the pieces of our 20-year marriage that included 2 kids now off at college and a house we'd barely paid down. She went on about how the pity would be unbearable, how Dad couldn't take another round of sympathetic pats on the back at the country club, and my brother Tom, ever the golden child with his perfect wife and their 2.5 kids, had already complained that my single status might cramp the vibe, so it was better if I just sat this one out, maybe grabbed a quiet meal with friends or something. As if that erased the sting of being sidelined by the people who'd raised me to believe blood was thicker than water. I sat there, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white, feeling that familiar burn in my chest that had started building ever since Mark confessed his affair over a cold dinner one night. The same burn that made me wonder if I'd been blind to the cracks in our life together, like how he'd always prioritized his sales trips over family weekends or how my own ambitions in marketing had been dismissed as hobbies. But I didn't yell or cry or demand explanations right then because something in me snapped into focus, a quiet resolve that felt more powerful than any outburst, and when she finally trailed off with a hesitant, "We love you, honey, but this is for the best," I simply said okay, my voice steady as a rock, and hung up without another word, letting that silence stretch out as my first act of revenge, a clever little nothing that said I wouldn't beg for a seat at their table anymore. In the days that followed, I threw myself into work, ignoring the pitying texts from cousins and the radio silence from Tom, focusing instead on this freelance gig I'd landed editing newsletters for a tech startup. The kind of job that paid just enough to keep the lights on but sparked something in me I'd long ignored, a drive to build something of my own without leaning on anyone, especially not the family that had just drawn a line in the sand. But as the rejection settled like a weight on my shoulders, making me second-guess every choice from marrying Mark too young to staying quiet. Now when part of me screamed to call them out, an email pinged in from an old colleague named Lisa, offering me a lead on a bigger opportunity in real estate consulting, something that could change everything if I took the risk. And just as I hovered over the reply button, wondering if this was fate or just another setup for disappointment, my phone lit up again with a number I didn't recognize, the voice on the other end low and urgent, whispering a warning about Mark that made my blood run cold. Could my ex be stirring up more trouble than I knew? The voice was muffled, like they were calling from a crowded street, and they said just enough to rattle me. "He's not over the divorce, Sarah. Watch your steps, he's got eyes on your new gigs." I hung up, heart racing, and stared at the blank wall, the apartment feeling smaller than ever. Was this some prank from a mutual friend, or something real that tied back to the family secrets I'd always suspected simmered under our perfect holiday? Facades? I didn't sleep much that night, replaying the call in my head, but by morning, I decided to push forward, emailing Lisa back with a yes that felt like jumping off a cliff. Little did I know, that leap would lead me straight into a storm I couldn't have imagined, One where my silence might not be enough to shield me from the backlash brewing just out of sight. That mysterious call lingered in my mind like a bad aftertaste from one of Mark's infamous barbecues, where he'd charm the socks off everyone while I handled the cleanup alone in the kitchen with suds up to my elbows and a forced smile plastered on. But I shook it off long enough to hit send on that email to Lisa, committing to the real estate consulting lead she dangled like a carrot in front of a horse that's been starved for too long, and what started as a tentative side gig quickly morphed into a full-throttle pivot that had me burning the midnight oil in my cramped Chicago apartment, surrounded by stacks of market analyses and property listings that painted pictures of lives far removed from the one I'd known back in Ohio, where family expectations kept everyone in neatly trimmed boxes with white picket fences and Sunday potlucks that masked the quiet desperations bubbling underneath. The divorce proceedings themselves had unfolded like a slow-motion car crash over those brutal months leading up to the disinvitation, beginning with Mark's confession one rainy Tuesday evening in our outdated colonial home, his face pale under the harsh kitchen fluorescence as he admitted to the affair with Jenna, his perky assistant who'd been joining him on those so-called essential business trips to conferences in Vegas and Miami, trips that left me holding down the fort with the kids' school runs and my part-time marketing job that barely covered the groceries. And when the lawyers got involved, it turned into a tug-of-war over assets that revealed how he'd funneled thousands into a hidden brokerage account meant for his fresh start, leaving me with the mortgage payments on a house now echoing with emptiness since Emily headed to college in Boston and Jake followed suit to a state school up north, both of them navigating their own tangled loyalties as Emily confided in me over tearful video chats about her dad's excuses and Jake sent neutral birthday cards that felt like walking on eggshells. My family waded into the mess with the subtlety of a bull in a china shop, Mom dispatching care packages of casseroles that came with unsolicited advice about reconciliation because men stray but families endure, Dad grumbling over phone calls about how Mark had been like a son to him before this foolishness, and Tom, my ever-competitive brother with his corner office in finance and a wife named Beth who organized charity events like they were Olympic sports, siding quietly with the narrative that I must have neglected the marriage by chasing my little career dreams, a dismissal that stung deeper than the asset split because it echoed the way they'd always prioritized appearances over authenticity, like sweeping Grandpa's old alcoholism under the rug during holidays or ignoring the whispers about Dad's questionable investments in the family hardware store that went belly up a decade ago. Yet through it all, I held my tongue during those tense family Zooms and mediation sessions, opting for a calculated silence that let Mark's inconsistencies unravel on their own, like when his lawyer slipped up about the affair timeline in court and the judge's eyebrow arched in a way that cost him alimony points. A small victory that felt like my first taste of witty payback without uttering a single accusation, and it was that same restraint I leaned on after the Thanksgiving snub, ignoring the trickle of apologetic texts from cousins like, "Sorry, family stuff gets weird," and the voicemail from Aunt Linda wondering if I was okay, because responding would have cracked open the floodgates to their pity or defensiveness, and I wasn't about to validate their choice by begging for scraps of inclusion. As the freelance consulting gigs piled up, I found myself advising clients on everything from undervalued condos in Wrigleyville to luxury flips along Lake Michigan, my marketing background giving me an edge in staging virtual tours that sold properties faster then hotcakes at a county fair, and the income stream grew steady enough to cover rent hikes and even a weekend getaway to clear my head, but doubts nagged at me during quiet moments, like when I'd catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror and wonder if this hustle was genuine reinvention or just a distraction from the ache of exclusion, especially since Emily mentioned in passing how Grandma had been oddly evasive about old family photos during her last visit home, hinting at skeletons tied to Mark's early days in the business that no one ever discussed. Then came the windfall that turned everything on its head, courtesy of Lisa's developer contact who needed urgent counsel on a portfolio of high-end rentals teetering on foreclosure. My analysis spotting a loophole in zoning laws that saved the deal and earned me a commission check for $200,000, wired directly to my account with a note saying it was just the beginning if I kept delivering, but as I printed the statement and tucked it into my drawer like a talisman against the loneliness. A prickle of unease settled in because the payout felt almost too effortless, like the universe was balancing some cosmic scale after the divorce fallout. And that anonymous number texted again that night with a grainy photo of Mark outside a nondescript office building, shaking hands with a man who looked vaguely familiar from Dad's old business cards. The message reading, "This money has strings, your family's pulling them," leaving me wide awake in the dark, phone clutched tight as I debated forwarding it to the authorities or confronting Tom directly. But before I could hit dial, Emily called in a panic, her voice breaking as she revealed she'd just argued with Grandma over Thanksgiving plans and overheard a snippet about Mark owing the family a debt that could drag us all down if my new success spotlighted it too brightly. Emily's panicked call hit me like a freight train barreling through the quiet of my apartment, her words tumbling out in a rush about how she'd pressed Grandma during that tense visit back in Ohio, catching her off guard while sorting through dusty boxes in the attic. And the old woman had snapped something about Mark's early involvement in Dad's failed hardware ventures, a debt he'd never fully cleared that lingered like a bad check in the family ledger, potentially tying my divorce settlement to unpaid loans that could surface now with my rising profile in real estate, making me wonder if the shunning wasn't just embarrassment, but a clumsy shield for their own vulnerabilities. But I calmed her down over the line, promising we'd dig into it later because dwelling on it would have derailed the momentum I'd built, and instead I channeled that fresh wave of resolve into expanding my consulting practice, networking at industry mixers in downtown Chicago, where power suits and handshakes flowed like the Chicago River, landing clients who needed my knack for spotting hidden value in overlooked properties. From historic brownstones in Lincoln Park ripe for renovation to speculative builds in the suburbs that promised returns in a market still rebounding from the pandemic dips. Those weeks blurred into a rhythm of site visits under gray skies, crunching numbers in coffee shops that smelled of fresh brews and ambition, and celebrating small wins like when I advised a widow on selling her lakeside cottage without getting gouged by fees. Her grateful hug reminding me why I'd pivoted from marketing drudgery to this, the tangible satisfaction of turning someone's uncertainty into stability, much like I was doing for myself after Mark's betrayal left me questioning every financial decision we'd made together, from the joint accounts he'd raided to the retirement plans he'd dismissed as my overthinking. The commissions rolled in steadily at first, then surged when Lisa introduced me to a consortium of investors eyeing luxury developments, my pitch on sustainable flips in eco-conscious neighborhoods sealing a deal that padded my savings with enough to buy something beyond rentals. And after sleepless nights scrolling listings on my phone during stakeouts of potential properties, I found it. A sprawling $2.9 million mansion on the North Shore, all sleek lines and expansive views of Lake Michigan that stretched like an endless promise. With 6 bedrooms for the kids' visits, a gourmet kitchen that mocked my old Formica counters, and a great room perfect for gatherings that didn't reek of obligation. Closing on it felt surreal, standing in the lawyer's office signing stacks of documents that bound me to this new chapter, the weight of the pen in my hand heavier than any divorce decree, and as movers hauled my boxes into spaces that echoed with potential, I felt a flicker of that witty revenge taking shape, not shouting from rooftops but building a life so undeniably better it spoke for itself, especially when I started planning my alternative Thanksgiving, texting Lisa and Karen about turning the place into a hub of real celebration, curating a guest list of loyal friends who'd weathered my storm without flinching, like my yoga instructor pal Maria, who shared divorce war stories over wine, and excluding the family orbit entirely. A deliberate snub that carried its own quiet satisfaction because inviting them would have diluted the triumph, turning it into another arena for their judgments. Preparations ramped up with trips to farmers markets for organic turkeys and heirloom sides, sourcing jazz playlists that evoked cozy evenings without the baggage of traditional hymns, and enlisting Emily and Jake for virtual input on decorations. Rustic lanterns and harvest wreaths that transformed the formal dining area into an inviting sprawl for 20, the kind of setup where conversations could meander from career pivots to Lighthearted gripes about exes without the undercurrent of scrutiny I'd endured at home, where mom's side eyes over my career choices always implied I should have settled for less to keep the peace. To amp the subtle payback, I posted a teaser on social media midweek, a photo of the mansion's facade dusted in early frost with the caption, "Brewing up a Thanksgiving full of fresh starts, no reservations needed." The wordplay landing just sharp enough to ping a few family acquaintances who liked it hesitantly, their comments probing like, "Looks amazing, Sarah, big changes," while I chuckled to myself over a solo cup of tea, knowing the real sting would come when the full event unfolded. But that growing conflict nagged at the edges, from Emily's updates on Grandma's worsening mood to Jake's offhand mention of Tom asking about my finances in a way that felt too casual, planting seeds of doubt about whether my success was stirring old pots I couldn't see boiling. As the big day loomed with final RSVPs confirming a lively crowd, that anonymous texter resurfaced with a jolt, sending a snapshot of Mom and Mark huddled at a corner booth in what looked like our old hometown diner, their expressions tense and conspiratorial. The accompanying note chilling. They're teaming up to spoil your party, dig into the debt docs before they do, or lose it all, leaving me frozen in the middle of wrapping silverware bundles, pulse thundering as I weighed ignoring it as paranoia or using it to fortify my defenses, the uncertainty twisting like a knife, because if they were plotting, my clever exclusions might not be enough to keep the past from crashing through the door. That anonymous snapshot of Mom and Mark in the diner burned a hole in my phone's gallery, like an unwelcome guest who wouldn't leave, their heads bowed over coffee mugs in a pose that screamed hushed negotiations. The kind that dredged up memories of how Mark had always schmoozed his way into family favors during our marriage, like sweet-talking Dad into co-signing that business loan for his first startup that ultimately tanked and left ripples we all pretended didn't exist. But with the party clock ticking down to hours, I shoved the image aside and threw myself into last-minute tweaks, directing the caterers through the mansion's sun-drenched foyer, where the scent of roasting turkey mingled with spiced cider simmering on the stove, creating an aroma that wrapped the house in a deceptive blanket of normalcy while my mind raced with what-ifs about their potential sabotage, whether it was showing up uninvited to air grievances or worse, stirring legal trouble over those shadowy debts that could tie my new asset to old liabilities. Guests began arriving right on cue as the afternoon light slanted golden through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Lisa bursting in first with arms laden in artisanal cheeses and a bottle of Pinot that promised to loosen tongues for the storytelling rounds, followed by Karen and her eclectic crew of fellow divorcees who'd formed a support circle during my roughest months, their laughter cutting through the setup bustle like a welcome distraction from the undercurrent of tension. Nodding my shoulders, and soon Emily and Jake pulled up in his beat-up SUV, lugging coolers of craft beers and homemade pies that Emily had baked with her boyfriend's help. Their hugs lingering a beat longer than usual as if sensing the storm clouds I kept bottled up, with Jake cracking a joke about how the place made his dorm room look like a cardboard box, easing the air just enough for me to guide everyone into the great room where tables groaned under platters of herb-crusted fowl, buttery mashed potatoes flecked with chives, and vibrant salads tossed with fall greens that I'd sourced from a nearby organic farm to symbolize fresh starts in more ways than one. The feast kicked off with a casual toast I led from the head of the table, raising my glass to the family we choose, the ones who show up without strings or side eyes, a line that drew chuckles and knowing nods from the group. The Motown tracks I'd queued up filling the spaces between bites with soulful grooves like Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" that prompted an impromptu sway among the younger crowd, while veterans like Maria shared tales of reinvention over seconds of cranberry sauce. Her story of flipping a condo after her own split mirroring my path in a way that made the gathering feel like a collective exhale from the pressures of traditional expectations, and as plates cleared and the sun dipped toward the horizon painting the lake in fiery hues, the energy shifted to lighter fare with board games erupting in playful rivalries around the coffee table, Karen dominating Monopoly with ruthless trades that had us all howling at her businesswoman persona. A far cry from the stifled dynamics of my Ohio holidays where conversations skirted politics and personal failings like landmines. Here, everything flowed with the authenticity of people who'd earned their scars. Jake even opening up about a recent breakup in a way that bonded him closer to the adults, his vulnerability a quiet victory that warmed me more than the crackling fireplace we'd gathered around for dessert. Capturing it all in snapshots felt natural amid the merriment. My phone clicking away at candlelit faces mid-laugh, the overflowing spread under the chandelier, and a group shot on the terrace where the crisp air carried hints of wood smoke from distant neighbors' fires, and before the evening wound down with lingering goodbyes and promises of holiday follow-ups, I uploaded a curated album to Instagram, the caption reading, "Thanksgiving in full bloom, laughter louder than doubts, music sweeter than pie, and a home brimming with the real stuff, no pity invites required." The subtle dig woven into gratitude that I hoped would land like a velvet glove over an iron fist, and sure enough, notifications lit up my screen as guests departed, friends' comments pouring in with heart emojis and cheers that validated the risk. But then the shift hit like a cold gust when Mom's profile popped up with her pointed query, "Is this a joke, Sarah?" Parading around like nothing happened while we're dealing with the fallout, followed by a flurry from relatives. Tom's like button pressed silently, but a cousin probing, "Where'd all this come from? Mark know about it." The barrage stirring that familiar burn of conflict even as I savored the party's afterglow, crafting a single reply to Mom that read, "No joke, just living without the script. Hope your table had room for honesty." 2. A witty parry that drew supportive replies from my circle and left me smirking in the empty kitchen as I wiped down counters. The satisfaction of that digital clapback a mini triumph that masked the growing unease, because within minutes the calls began in earnest, Dad's gravelly tone leaving a voicemail about getting the family back on track laced with undertones of financial concern. Tom's direct line buzzing with urgency about something you need to hear before it blows up, and then Emily texting in real time that she'd spotted Mark's car idling near the gate on her drive out. The anonymous source capping it with a voice note detailing how the debt from Dad's old loans wasn't just Mark's alone, but involved a forged signature that could implicate Tom if my success drew scrutiny. The revelation hanging like a guillotine as I sank onto the couch. The mansion's grandeur suddenly feeling like a spotlight on secrets ready to erupt and question every boundary I'd so carefully drawn. The barrage of calls turned my post-party sanctuary into a war zone of ringing silences and half-formed regrets. The mansion's vastness amplifying each vibration from my phone like echoes in an empty cathedral as I paced the dimly lit kitchen with a mug of cooling chamomile gripped like a lifeline. The remnants of pie crumbs on the island mocking the chaos, because while the evening's joy had been real and radiant, this onslaught peeled back the layers to expose the raw underbelly of ties I thought I'd severed clean, starting with Tom's insistent line that I finally answered after the fifth ring. His voice a mix of brotherly concern and cornered defensiveness as he launched into an apology for the disinvitation that rang hollow against the backdrop of his earlier complaints. Admitting he'd amplified Mark's version of events to Mom and Dad to avoid rocking the family boat, but now with my social media splash hitting their feeds during their own strained dinner, where the turkey came out dry and conversations fizzled into weather talk, he couldn't ignore how it highlighted their exclusion, and as he pivoted to the real bombshell, confessing that the anonymous warnings weren't baseless paranoia, but tied to a forged document from years back when Mark sweet-talked him into co-signing a side loan for one of Dad's desperate hardware store extensions. A deal that soured and left Tom holding a liability he'd buried under his rising career, fearing my newfound wealth and visibility might trigger audits or lawsuits that dragged his name through the mud. That revelation twisted the knife deeper than any family slight, making me see the shunning not as simple embarrassment over my divorce, but a preemptive strike to keep me sidelined from prying into finances they'd all colluded to obscure. With Mom's diner meet-up with Mark likely a frantic bid to buy his silence using scraps from the old settlement, and Dad's voicemail that followed Tom's call only confirmed it, his gruff tone cracking with uncharacteristic vulnerability as he grumbled about protecting what we've built, while hinting at a visit to sort this mess. but the subtext screamed desperation over the debts that could unravel their suburban facade. The one where country club memberships masked mounting credit card bills and Tom's perfect life hid the stress of covering shortfalls from Beth's endless renovations. Emily texted midstream with her own layer of turmoil, having confronted Jake about what he'd overheard from Tom during a sibling call, revealing that Mark had been leveraging the family secret to pressure them into influencing me toward a quiet divorce without alimony hikes. A manipulation that explained his recent radio silence, broken only by oily overtures now that my success painted a target on the shared assets, and as the pieces clicked into a mosaic of betrayal that spanned decades from Mark's entry into the family circle as the charming outsider who'd exploited every weak link to the way I'd stayed quiet through it all, prioritizing harmony over hard truths. I felt that familiar surge of doubt about my choices, wondering if my restraint had been noble resilience or foolish enabling that let the rot fester unchecked. A decision that had audiences in my head shaking their fists because who wouldn't blast the lot of them after the first lie? But instead of exploding in accusations that would have fed their victim narrative, I opted for a final, calculated revenge in the form of a group message drafted with careful wit, addressing Mom, Dad, Tom, and even looping in Mark for good measure. Appreciate the outreach, but my table's set for those who build up, not borrow from the past. Debts paid in honesty only, no more IOUs on family. Hitting send with a wry smile that masked the ache because it drew a line without descending into the fray, a boundary so firm it forced them to confront their roles without my hand extended in easy forgiveness, and the responses trickled. In like hesitant rain, Mom's tear-streaked plea for a call that I let go to voicemail, Tom's fumbling offer to explain over coffee that I ignored, and Dad's curt acknowledgement hinting at legal steps to clear the air, each one chipping at the triumph I'd savored hours earlier. As the night wore on with the lake's waves lapping rhythmically against the shore visible from my bedroom window, Mark's call pierced the quiet at last, his voice smooth as aged whiskey laced with poison as he proposed an amicable chat about revisiting the settlement terms now that I'd landed on my feet so spectacularly, dangling hints of evidence on the forged signature that could tie me to the mess if I didn't play ball. But I cut him off mid-sentence with a light, humorous deflection. Sounds like you've got a full plate of regrets, Mark. Mine's cleared for new recipes, and hung up, the click echoing my resolve even as that anonymous texter sent one last cryptic note. Tom holds the original docs, confront him, or let the courts decide your piece, leaving the truth tantalizingly out of reach because while I'd glimpsed the web of complicity that explained their cruelty, the full unraveling hung on choices I hadn't made yet, like whether to lawyer up and expose it all or extend an olive branch that risked more pain. Staring at a faded photo from a long-ago Thanksgiving where we all smiled like the cracks weren't there, I pondered if this comeback had truly liberated me from the cycle of conditional love or merely gilded the cage with mansion walls and social media likes. The ambiguity settling like fog over the water because in the end, revenge tasted sweet but left a lingering question. Was the family I rebuilt strong enough to weather the one I'd left behind, or would the unanswered debts pull us all under in ways I couldn't yet foresee?